Look closely at the foundation of the American legal system, and you will find a quiet transformation has taken place. The original bedrock has been swapped out, retaining the outward appearance of law while hollowing out its actual substance. For generations, American jurisprudence relied on common law adjudication and strictly fixed constitutional protections. Today, that framework is actively being displaced by a system of procedural administration. This displacement occurred without a constitutional amendment or a vote by the sovereign public. It was executed from within, through procedural rulemaking, specifically the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure. To understand how this happened, we must examine a seemingly administrative update. We will deconstruct how the merging of law and equity under Rule 2 successfully bypassed strict constitutional boundaries. We will map the immutable hierarchy of law from the sovereign people down to administrative rules, and locate the exact point where modern courts snap the chain of lawful authority. When courts derive their power from institutional procedure instead of a constitutional source, they cease to exercise delegated authority. They operate under assumed power, voiding the legitimacy of the system. Governmental authority in the United States does not self-generate. Every exercise of power must be proven by tracing it upward through a continuous, unbroken chain of lawful delegation. At the top of this chain are the sovereign people who hold the ultimate source of lawful authority. They delegate a portion of that power downward into the Constitution, which serves as the codified, permanent expression of their will. This text operates as the absolute, binding rule of action for all departments of government. It is a strict mandate, not an advisory framework. The Constitution permits the creation of statutes, representing specific delegated authority granted to the legislature within strict constitutional bounds. Finally, statutes authorize the lowest tier, procedural rules. These exist solely to execute and administer the higher laws. This structure dictates a mandatory hierarchical rule. Higher law always governs lower law. An inferior procedural rule can never redefine the superior source it derives from. There is a firm boundary between the statutory delegation and the procedural rule. This line represents the division between substantive rights and mere administrative process. If any rule or action breaks this strict top-down flow, it ceases to be delegated authority, instantly becoming an unlawful assumption of power. Within the federal system, courts generate their procedural frameworks through a specific statutory mechanism. The judiciary possesses no inherent constitutional power to draft these rules. The authority to do so is conditionally delegated to them by Congress. The delegation is codified in the Rules Enabling Act. It attaches a strict condition. Such rules shall not abridge, enlarge, or modify any substantive right. This establishes a clear legal distinction. Procedure governs how a case proceeds through the system. Substance defines the actual fundamental rights at stake in the controversy. These two categories are not interchangeable. A rule of procedure is merely an instrument of execution, never an independent source of legal creation. Any procedural rule that alters a substantive right directly violates the statutory limit placed upon it. When a procedural rule crosses that line, it stands without lawful foundation, rendering it strictly void from its inception. To understand the impact of crossing that line, we must look at how the justice system operated before modern procedural frameworks existed. Historically, the primary engine of justice was the common law, operating through a rigid pipeline anchored by a trial by jury. Running beneath it, a supplementary pipeline known as equity provided remedies through a judge's discretion only where common law was silent. This relationship was governed by a strict maxim defined by jurists like William Blackstone: equity follows the law. Under this framework, equitable intervention by a judge was strictly subordinate. Discretion could never be used to override or displace common law rights, and it could never overrule the verdict of a jury. Keeping these two systems separate ensured fundamental rights were adjudicated by a jury of peers, isolating ultimate authority from the hands of government agents. Maintaining the partition between common law and equity was a strict jurisdictional requirement, existing to protect substantive rights from arbitrary power. That structural protection was dismantled by the introduction of Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 2. The text of the rule is brief. There is one form of action, the civil action. On the surface, this reads like a straightforward administrative update, designed to streamline court proceedings and reduce paperwork. By combining the systems, Rule 2 collapsed the protective partition between fixed common law into a single unified civil action. Inside this unified structure, strict boundaries dissolve. Discretionary elements bleed into and contaminate the rigid parameters of common law protections. The direct consequence is that equitable discretion is now functionally elevated to the exact same plane as fixed constitutional rights. In practice, an undisputed constitutional right to a jury trial can be bypassed simply by recharacterizing a legal claim under this new discretionary framework. Because Rule 2 alters fundamental rights and remedies, it ceases to be a procedural instrument, acting as an unauthorized substantive rewrite of the law. This diagram shows the hierarchy of law established earlier. When procedural rules alter substantive rights, they invert the hierarchy. The rule pushes upward, shattering the boundary between execution and creation, bypassing the Constitution itself. When a delegated agent, like the court, exceeds its granted authority, its actions are legally void. Power that must be implied is power not granted. What remains is a hybridized system that dominates modern American jurisprudence. This diagram illustrates the contrast. On the left is the linear chain of lawful authority. On the right is the hybridized system, a circular, closed loop of institutional process and judicial ratification, completely severed from the sovereign people. This system maintains the outward forms and terminology of constitutional law, but its substance is driven entirely by procedural self-validation. Inside this closed loop, authority is no longer traced back to the Constitution. It is inferred from its own exercise and sustained purely through repetition. The Constitution guarantees a republican form of government, which relies on the principle that law governs the government, not the discretion of its officers. Legitimacy in the American legal system must be measured by conformity to its constitutional source, never by mere adherence to institutional process. When a legal system allows unconstrained procedural rules to dictate fundamental rights, the chain of delegation is broken, and lawful authority systematically ceases to exist.